see here. James, I'm pushing this button and nothing seems to be happening. Is James here still? Oh, yeah, okay. Okay, they're taking care of it. Okay, hey, that's all right. Let's see that. Does this one work? Yes? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, all right, great. So good to be back with you again. My wife pointed out to me as I was getting dressed that I'm wearing Mount Vernon colors tonight, right? I'm wearing green. Close, maybe not quite the right shade of green. So Jonathan and I both had sons playing football. I was going to say this year, but I guess for the past few years they would have both been playing high school football. And Jonathan and I met out on the football field. I think it was here at Mount Vernon after their last game. And he had on his green and I had on my red, and we took a picture together. And Jonathan pointed out we looked like a Christmas tree. You know, we were green and red. So, but I could have wore red tonight, but I wore green. Not really intending, but here you go, in Mount Vernon colors. Let me try pushing this button again. Still not happening. You guys can push it for me, maybe. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we are. Okay. I don't know if I did that or they did it, but it happened. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians 13. We're going to be in what's called the love chapter. There's a story about, and by the way, I was thinking and I was asking my wife, what did I talk about last year at Mount Vernon? She didn't remember. I can't remember for sure. I think it's the Sermon on the Mount is what I talked about last year. I'll hold it down here. So you guys probably don't remember either. Here's what I've decided. I'm going to start keeping a journal of what I talk about when I go to different places so that I don't talk about the same thing year after year, that kind of thing. So I also don't know what stories I told you last year. But have you ever spent some time talking to an older person? Of course, you might be an older person, but maybe you're speaking with a senior citizen, and you might find that they tell the same stories over and over again. And so if I'm telling stories tonight that you heard from me last year, just treat me like you would a senior citizen and smile and be nice and say, bless his heart, he's telling the same stories that he told already. But there's a story about an old man and an old woman who lived next door to one another, and they hated each other. Oh, they hated each other. And every morning they would come out and get their newspaper, and they would just trade insults, across the fence there from her front yard and his front yard, and they would just say the most awful things to each other. And one morning this particular lady said, you know what? If I was your wife, I would put poison in your food. And his response to that, he said, well, if I was your husband, I would eat it. I would gladly take it, And here's so often I'm afraid that really is kind of what we have going on in our world. Maybe not to that extent, though maybe in some cases. And maybe it's not two people talking to each other in their front yard, but maybe it's on social media. I don't know if you're on social media or not, but man, people can get really ugly toward one another on social media. And I'm not a big news watcher guy. Though lately I've been trying to watch a little more news, but it hasn't taken me too long watching the news. And if you watch the news, or even if you don't, probably you are aware that our world there's a lot of hate, a lot of violence, war, and I was thinking about that old song, and I didn't even take the time to look up who sang it or anything like that. But you probably remember an old song that was on the radio that had the lyrics, "What the world needs now is love, sweet love." You remember that? And I think that's still true. That's what the world needs is love. But here's the thing. I can't force people to love, and you can't force people to love. And I don't expect us to get everyone in this world to start loving like they should. But what I can do and what you can do is we can each do our part, right? We can be people who love. You can be that. I can be that. So I think it's worth our time, don't you, to spend some time looking in the famous love chapter. It's called the love chapter because that's what the chapter's about, really, basically from beginning to end. I mean, there's some other things that are kind of talked about as well, but it's a chapter that's about love. And even though the whole chapter, we could look at, we're really just going to focus on the first 7 verses. The last 6 verses we won't look at tonight, not because they are important, don't get me wrong, but we'll just, for our purposes tonight, focus on the first 7 verses. And I want you to, first of all, notice the first 3 verses with me, where Paul brings up these various scenarios. And just, are you with me there? 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Let me read the first, I guess I should probably turn there as well. That might be good. I left my Bible in the car when I first walked in, so I'm not doing too good here. But here we go. Okay. 1 Corinthians 13, 1 through 3. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. So notice Paul describes these scenarios. I'd say he's also using what is considered hyperbole. Hyperbole, it's an exaggeration for the sake of an effect. I mean, he's describing these really kind of extreme situations, and just describing situations where you might think, wow, that is amazing. I mean, well, he starts off talking about speaking in tongues, which, 1 Corinthians 13 wasn't just written all by itself. It's part of a larger context. It's part of course, the book of 1 Corinthians. And really, it's part of a section that starts in chapter 12, where Paul's talking about these miraculous spiritual gifts like speaking in tongues. And so he starts out, if I do that, if I speak in tongues, but I don't have love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. He talks about miracles in verse 2. He talks about like moving mountains, and I got the picture of the mountains. We were just talking to Graylin and Crystal a little while ago, and their son got married over in the mountains recently, and maybe you've been to the mountains already this summer or intend to go or whatever, but you imagine something as enormous as a mountain being moved. Jesus talked about that kind of thing, and Paul talks about it here, and you might say, wow, that would be so amazing. And it would be, but as amazing as it is, as Paul says there in verse 2, if you do that but you don't have love, then you're nothing. And then he talks about some scenarios in verse 3. He says, if I give all my possessions to feed the poor. That's a great thing. Isn't that basically what Jesus told the rich young ruler to do? Remember that story? You can read it in Matthew chapter 19. If I give all my possessions to feed the poor. I assume probably here in Mount Vernon you guys have charities where maybe you can take food and it'll be distributed to the poor. Or in Seneca, there's a place called the Seneca Food Pantry, and you can donate food to them, or you can donate anything, clothing or household items, and then they sell those things. And ultimately it's an operation that exists to help the poor in the city of Seneca. Of course, the church also helps people, but if you were to give everything, all that you possess to feed the poor. Now, somebody might say that is love right there. But Paul says, no, you can do that and still be an unloving person. And if you are an unloving person, then, well, it profits you nothing. The last example he gives there in verse 3, he says, if I surrender my body to be burned, which I don't know what comes to your mind when you think about surrendering your body to be burned. Maybe you remember that Old Testament story about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because that's what they did, right? Rather than worship a statue, they surrendered their bodies to be burned, but God took care of them. And maybe that's what Paul's thinking about when he writes those words. There's another story. It's not in the Bible. It's in my Bible because I wrote it in my Bible, but it's not originally in the Bible. It actually takes place a little bit after Bible times. Listen to this story. On February the 23rd, in the year AD 155, an 86-year-old man named Polycarp was burned at the stake for refusing to denounce Jesus and say, Caesar is Lord. When threatened with death, he said, 86 years I've served Christ. He's done me no wrong. How then can I blaspheme my king who saved me? It is said that he refused to be tied to the stake, believing Jesus would help him endure his execution. Well, that's an amazing story, right? That's so inspiring. But notice that Paul says, if you do that, if you do something like that,
but you don't have love, it profits you nothing. So keep these verses in mind. This shows us how extremely important love really is. And what I want to do is, before we close tonight, I want to come back to those verses once again. But let's spend the majority of our time looking at verses 4 through 7. Okay? 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 7, where here Paul tells us, here's what love is. You know, what are you talking about when you say love, Paul? Are you talking about romance? Are you talking about, we use the word love for so many things, right? Like, for example, I love a good, you know what I really love is Pizza Hut Pepperoni Lovers Pizza. Have you had that? It's even got the word love in the title, right? Pepperoni Lovers Pizza. And I really like it when they put it in a deep dish, you know what I mean? And can I tell, here, I have a complaint about Mount Vernon. Last year, when we came here, we had planned to eat at Pizza Hut. And when we got here, do you know what? You can't eat at Pizza Hut here in Mount Vernon. All you can do is pick up a pizza and take it somewhere else to eat it. So we ended up doing something else last year. But anyway, I love that. But, we use the word love to talk about pizza. We use the word love in a romantic way. We have that word for so many things. But Paul tells us exactly what he has in mind in this passage. And by the way, this is a passage that is, I think, often used to describe like marriage. And I think it absolutely has application to marriage. In fact, you husbands and wives in this room, you absolutely should apply these verses to your marriage. But don't stop with applying it to your marriage, because Paul's not talking about marriage in the chapter. No, I would say apply these verses to every relationship, to every person that you encounter, including your spouse. But here's what Paul has in mind when he says love. Here's how he defines it. Look at verses 4 through 7. 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7. He says, love is patient, love is kind, and it is not jealous. Love does not brag and is not arrogant, does not act unbecomingly. It does not seek its own, is not provoked, does not take into account a wrong suffered, does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. So let's dig in. And we won't talk about all of these in great detail. We'll probably spend more time on some of them than others, but let's look at Paul's definition of love here. The first thing he tells us, he says, number one, and my remote's not working again here. Somebody's going to have to advance it for me, I guess, back there. Oh, no, now it is. Now it is. Just kidding. Okay, number one, he says love is patient. Here's another story. There's a man who found himself stuck in traffic. He was at a traffic light. The light was green, but there was a car in front of him that was not moving. So he started honking his horn, and the car still did not move. Nowadays, if a situation like that happens, it might be because the person's looking down at their phone, right? They're looking at their phone instead of looking at the traffic light. Well, he kept honking his horn, and the car still would not move. Finally, he sees a woman get out of the car. She walks back to him. He rolls down his window, and she says, listen, mister, I'm having a hard time getting my car to go. If you want to go up there and try to get my car to go, I'll sit back here and I'll honk your horn for you. This man wasn't being very patient. And really, the woman wasn't doing anything wrong. Here's the reality, though. Not only are we impatient, perhaps sometimes, when somebody's not even doing anything wrong, isn't it true that sometimes people do things that are wrong? Maybe somebody says something to you that is, maybe just their tone of voice wasn't quite what it should have been. Maybe the words themselves were not quite what they should have been. Maybe it was an action that was taken towards you that was not what it should have been. What do we do in those situations? Well, we should still be patient. There's this great passage in Proverbs. It's Proverbs chapter 19, verse 11. And, the translation that I use that I'm reading out of tonight is the New American Standard Bible. But I find it very helpful to compare different Bible translations. And we'll be doing that a lot of that tonight. We'll be looking at what different translations say. Let me start with here the NIV in this verse. It says, a person's wisdom yields patience. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. Now, in my translation, in the New American Standard, that verse is worded like this. A man's discretion makes him slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook a transgression. So you notice there's some slight differences there, like instead of wisdom, it says discretion. Instead of offense, it says transgression. But then also, you'll notice instead of patience, it says slow to anger. But I'll tell you what, I think that's pretty helpful because really, isn't that a good definition of what patience is? Being patient is being slow to anger. That's what it is, right? Being patient is being slow to anger. And notice, here's somebody, they have said something offensive or done something offensive. They've wronged you in some way. Maybe it was the words they said or the way that they said those words or some action they took or whatever, some oversight. How are you going to respond? Are you going to respond in anger? Or I think this passage is so wonderful. You know something you can do? Just overlook it. Just overlook it. Just ignore it. Just go on with your life. And that's the glorious thing to do, right? It is to one's glory to just overlook. And so, what are you? Are you somebody who is wise? Somebody who shows discretion? Somebody who is slow to anger? Is patient? In other words, that's what love is, right? Number one, Paul says love is patient. Think about this. Number two, Paul says love is kind. And, it's so easy to be kind to people that are kind to you, right? I mean, that I think just pretty much comes naturally to us, right? Is to be kind to someone who's kind to you. The hard thing to do is to be kind to somebody who's not kind to you. But we need to do that as well. Sometimes I'll see something on Facebook. It might say something like, I'll be respectful of anyone who's respectful of me. And while maybe that sounds good to people in general, that's not Christianity, right? We are respectful, we are kind to people, whether they are respectful or kind to us or not. Kind to all. And of course, you remember Jesus had a lot to say about loving your enemies. He talked about it in his famous Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew chapter 5. There's a sermon very similar to the Sermon on the Mount. It's sometimes been called the Sermon on the Plain. It's in Luke chapter 6. And I want you to see what Jesus said in Luke chapter 6, verse number 35, when he's talking about this subject. He said, "But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men." Now notice in this passage, Jesus really seems to be using the words love and kind interchangeably. And appropriately so, because as Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4, that's what love is. Love is kind. How is God kind to ungrateful and evil men? Well, if we compare this passage to the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is talking about the same thing in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about being sons of your Father who causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, Stan said something about the rain. You all been getting a lot of rain here in Mount Vernon, I assume. We've been getting a lot of rain in Seneca. I know that sun and rain can both be bad things. The sun can be bad if you get a sunburn. That's painful. It can be really bad if you get skin cancer. That's an awful thing. Rain can be a bad thing if you get too much of it. There's flooding, right? That kind of thing. But that's not when Jesus says that God causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous, he's talking about God's blessings. Because we need sunshine and rain to have food, right? For your crops to grow, for your gardens to grow. I don't know if you're a farmer or a gardener perhaps. If you don't get that rain, then you're going to be getting out your hose or something, right? To water those plants. We need sunshine and rain. And that's what Jesus has in mind there. He's saying that God is kind to everybody. He doesn't send the sunshine and the rain just to good people. He sends the sunshine and the rain to all people. And likewise, he's teaching us we need to, if we're going to be sons, and I think the idea of be sons of God really is show yourself to be a son of God. It's that old expression, like father, like son, which was especially true in that day where, Jesus, he was a carpenter. He was raised by Joseph, who was a carpenter, like father, like son. That kind of thing is still true. In some cases, maybe maybe children don't necessarily have the same job as their parents, but I tell you, I think kids very often will be in a number of ways like their parents. For example, maybe the dad likes a certain sports team, and the children then also like that same sports team. That's just kind of the way things often work. And what Jesus is saying is, when we are kind to people that are unkind to us, when we're kind to our enemies, when we love our enemies, it's like father, like son. We are showing ourselves to be sons of God. And so, yeah, be kind. Love is kind. And I love that expression that says, be kind because everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. Hey, and isn't that true of you? I don't know everybody in here, and even if I do know you, I don't know everything that's going on in your life, but I am very confident that there's stuff going on in your life. Maybe it's a health problem, maybe it's a relationship problem, maybe it's a financial problem, maybe it's all of the above, maybe it's something else or a lot of other things. You're dealing with something, and the last thing that you need is for somebody to come along and be a jerk to you, right? But what you could really appreciate is some kindness. Be kind because everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle, and love is kind. All right, notice this, the third thing Paul tells us about love in 1 Corinthians 13, he says love isn't jealous, or as some translations will say, it doesn't envy. It doesn't envy. This makes me think about, there's an episode of the best TV show of all time, The Andy Griffith Show. Now, you may not think the Andy Griffith Show is the best show of all time, but you can be wrong. That's all right. I'll let you be wrong on that. I love that show. I watch it pretty much every day, really. And there's an episode that's maybe a lesser-known episode because it's one of the later ones, and Barney's not in it. But it's about Andy's aunt, Aunt Bee, and she's on a game show, and she wins all these prizes, like these kitchen appliances and a mink coat, wins all of these prizes on a game show, and she has her friends come over and see them, and I think the comments made, nobody has anything like this here, in our town. And as the episode goes on, she wants to have her friends over, and they all turn her down. They say they're sick or they have some other appointment. But really what's going on is they're jealous or they're envious. Rather than just being happy for her that she has all these nice things, they're having a bad attitude about it. Well, at the end of the episode, she ends up getting rid of the things for tax purposes. And then she invites her friends over, and now they come. And it's almost like with friends like that, who needs enemies, right? Shouldn't your friends be happy for you when good things, or no, maybe we should put it the other way around. Shouldn't you be happy for your friends or happy for other people when good things happen for them, rather than saying, I really wish that was happening for me. I wish I was getting the attention that so-and-so is getting. I wish I had the car or the house or the whatever that so-and-so has. I wish I had the job that so-and-so has. I wish I had the opportunity that so-and-so. No. Love isn't like that. Love isn't jealous, or as some translations say, it doesn't envy. Notice this, Paul tells us this about love. He tells us that love doesn't brag and isn't arrogant. There's an illustration that Jesus gives in Luke chapter 18, where really here's an example of a guy who is arrogant and is a guy who brags. It's the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Listen to this parable. Luke chapter 18, verse 9. It says, Jesus told this parable to people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and they viewed others with contempt. Or the King James says they despised others. Or maybe we could say they hated others. Isn't that interesting? We're talking about love tonight. Here are people, they trust in themselves that they are righteous, and they hate others. I think those things are related. Here's the story, verse 10, Luke 18:10. Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself. Now, let me pause here. Before we read his prayer, notice that in this prayer, this guy's just going to be bragging and bragging. Here's what he says. He says, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get. Well, notice the contrast here. Verse 13, but the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. Notice, for one thing, this guy, he was bragging. That's what his prayer was, right? I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all that I get. And I'm certainly not like these other people. And he's so arrogant, so proud, so conceited, so haughty, right? And notice this, love, it doesn't brag. It isn't arrogant. And really, I think there's so many connections here that we can make. One of them is to go back to being patient. Or here in a little while, we're going to see that love isn't easily angered, which is really the same thing. There's a connection, I believe, to anger and arrogance. And here's why. Here's why I say that. Isn't it true? And hopefully it's not true with you. But if you do some self-examination and you're honest, you might find that this is true. Is it true that so often the reason that you're angry is because your pride has been wounded? Your ego has taken a hit, right? How dare they speak to me like that? How dare I be treated like that? You know, this kind of thing. And so wouldn't it be true then, the less pride you have, the less angry you get? And so, you know, maybe you don't recognize arrogance in yourself, but maybe you can recognize anger in yourself. And you might want to stop and ask, where is this anger coming from? Why am I so angry? Is it because I'm so proud? Because my ego's so big? Because I can't take a hit to my ego? Is it because my pride is wounded? See, I think that we're going to be happier people, less angry people, if we are not arrogant, not proud. And love isn't. Love doesn't brag, and it isn't arrogant. Notice this, another thing Paul tells us about love. He tells us love doesn't act unbecomingly. Now, that's the New American Standard. We don't ever say unbecomingly. Here's how some other translations put it. The English Standard Version says love isn't rude. Well, we understand that, right? Love isn't rude. Or the NIV words it this way, love does not dishonor others. And this makes me think about a passage over in 1 Peter. Peter says in 1 Peter 2, verse 17, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Notice that, honor all people. And now he ends the verse with honor the king, which the king at that time was a man named Nero. We don't have a king in our culture. I know that there's been some protests recently that are called no kings. And we do have a president, of course. I believe that people should be respectful of President Trump. I believe that people should be respectful of former President Biden. I think that people should have been a lot more respectful than they were of President Biden while he was still in office. That let's go Brandon thing, that should have never have existed. That was so disrespectful to President Biden. And so, but notice this, it's not just honor the king. The first part of the verse says, honor all people. And so it's almost like Paul saying, honor all people, including the king. Don't leave him out, right? Honor all people. You should be respectful of every person, whether it's the highest person in the land or the lowest person in the land. And I'm not going to say who the lowest person, I don't want to, maybe it's you, your job, I don't know. But whoever the lowest would be, you should be respectful of them as well. Just of all people. Don't be rude. Treat people with honor in the way that you talk to them, in the way that you talk about them. Here's one scenario where this might play out. What about when you're eating at a restaurant? And maybe your waiter or your waitress gets your order wrong. Or maybe they've taken a really long time, or maybe the bill is wrong. Don't be rude to your waiter. Treat them with honor. Maybe they messed up. Maybe they did wrong. You still need to treat them with honor. Don't be rude. Treat everybody with honor. So love does not act unbecomingly. In other words, it's not rude. It doesn't dishonor others. And then notice this, Paul also tells us love doesn't seek its own. Or the New Century Version says it like this, love isn't selfish. It isn't selfish. This makes me think about Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 and 4, where Paul says, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others. So let me challenge you to do a little self-examination. as you're going throughout your day, who are you thinking about? Who are you looking out for? Are you just looking out for number one, what you want, what you think you need, or are you thinking of others? Are you regarding one another as more important than yourself? I'll tell you what, something I think about every now and then is even in my prayers. I feel like sometimes I'm guilty of being selfish in my prayers, meaning I'm just thinking about myself when I pray, and I don't want to do that. I want to think about others in my prayers as well. And so, don't be selfish. Love, it doesn't seek its own, or simply put, love isn't selfish. And then think about this. Paul tells us that love, it isn't provoked. Now, what does that mean? Here's how the NIV puts it. Love isn't easily angered. Now, you might say, didn't we already talk about this? Or maybe put it like this. Didn't Paul already talk about this? I think he did. When he said love isn't patient. You remember how I told you a good definition of patience, I think, is slow to anger, which is exactly what we're seeing right here. Love is not easily angered. And so why would Paul say it twice? Well, and the first time he's saying it, in a positive way, here's what love is. And now he's saying it in a negative way. Here's what love isn't, right? Kind of like if you were to ask me, hey, would you like something to eat? And I might say, no. I'm not hungry, I'm full. That's two ways of saying the same thing, but one is, approach from the negative, I'm not hungry. The other is from the positive, I am full. And I think that's what Paul's doing here. First he tells us love is patient, meaning slow to anger. And now here's what it's not. It's not easily angered. And so we don't have to spend a long time on this. In fact, let me just point you once again to that verse. Proverbs 19, verse 11. I think it's a great verse. A man's discretion makes him slow to anger. It is his glory to overlook a transgression. Learn to overlook. Now, by the way, I don't think this means necessarily that everything in life should always be overlooked. Sometimes things have to be addressed. Some things are, we've got to take care of some things. But wouldn't you agree, most things really don't need to be addressed. Most things aren't that big of a deal. And I think it's so much better just to let it roll off your shoulders, move on with your life, let it be water under the bridge, let sleeping dogs lie, that. Just leave it be and move on with your life. And that's the glorious thing to do. Love isn't provoked, or in other words, it's not easily angered. And then Paul tells us this. He says, love doesn't take into account a wrong suffered. Or as the NIV puts it, love keeps no record of wrongs. So this past Sunday night, I preached from Jeremiah. Jeremiah was Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34, where there's a prophecy about a new covenant. And then that passage is quoted in Hebrews chapter 8. The writer to the Hebrews talks about it. But part of what was said there, God said, I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. That's what it says there in Jeremiah 31, verse 34, and those words are quoted there in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 12. Notice that God forgives and God forgets. I will remember their sins no more. And that's what we need to do as well. Love, it doesn't take into account a wrong suffered, or love keeps no record of wrongs. And then notice this. Love doesn't rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. Now, as I said a little while ago, 1 Corinthians 13 was not written all by itself. It's a part of a context. It's a part of a larger book. It's a part of the letter called 1 Corinthians. And I really strongly suspect that when Paul says love doesn't rejoice in unrighteousness, he's thinking back to something he talked about back in chapter 5. And we won't read that whole chapter, but that's a situation where there was a man in the church in Corinth who had his father's wife. And Paul says, don't even eat with this man. I mean, this was a serious business. And so I suspect that's what he has in mind when he says love doesn't rejoice in unrighteousness. In particular, in their situation, that unrighteousness of this man with his father's wife. But of course, the application would be for a number of things. How many lifestyles are there that are contrary to God's word, and yet people rejoice in them, have pride in them, that kind of thing? But notice that instead of rejoicing in unrighteousness, love rejoices with the truth. There's a couple of passages toward the end of the New Testament, 2 John and 3 John. Let me flip over there real quick. 2 John is a little letter that Paul wrote to a lady. We don't know who the lady is, or, there's different thoughts about exactly who she is. But listen to what John says in 2 John chapter 1, verse 4. I was very glad. What, John? What made you very glad? I was very glad to find some of your children walking in truth. He says something very similar in 3 John. This is a letter that he wrote to a man named Gaius. He tells him in 3 John chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, I was very glad when brethren came and testified to your truth, that is, how you are walking in truth. I have no greater joy than this, to hear of my children walking in the truth. Now, I don't think that John is talking about literal, actual children there, but I think if you're a mom or a dad, aren't you so happy when your children walk in the truth, and it breaks your heart when they make bad decisions, right? And so we understand this completely, but here's what love does. Love doesn't rejoice in unrighteousness. It rejoices with the truth. And then Paul says these four things as he wraps up his discussion about what love is. He says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now, it seems that the first thing in the list and the last thing in the list are related to one another, similar to one another. And then the second thing and the third thing on the list, likewise, kind of have a similarity to them. But in fact, the first one, love bears all things. This is not the first time in 1 Corinthians Paul has said those words. Back in chapter 9, verse 12, here's where Paul's talking about paying preachers, and he says in verse 11, if we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? In verse 12, he says, if others share the right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we do not use this right, but we endure all things. Well, the word endure there, it's the same word that's translated bear here in chapter 13, verse 7. I guess you could translate chapter 13, verse 7 like this. Love endures all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. So there's a connection there. And let's talk about that love believes all things. Some commentators will say basically that this means that you believe the best about someone. Give people the benefit of the doubt. I want to share with you something that was written by Steve Higginbotham. Steve is a preacher over in Knoxville, Tennessee. And he wrote an article called, What a Terrible Day. Listen to this. Today I had a terrible day. This is as the article goes on, you see this is a woman talking here. She says, everyone was against me. Some days I get so frustrated with people. Some days I wish I didn't have to deal with people at all. They can be so unreasonable. Today was one of those days. Today was trash day. I took out our trash the night before, but when I pulled out of our driveway, I noticed our grouchy neighbor had thrown a piece of trash in our yard close to our trash can. But then the article points out, actually, the neighbor didn't. The wind just blew it over. It goes on to say, after dropping the children off at the school, I needed to make a left-hand turn into a long line of traffic. I saw one of my friends in line and thought she would let me out in front of her. She saw me, but she wouldn't let me out. Some friend she is. But then the article points out, really, she didn't see you. She was miles away in her own thoughts. Next, the lady here says, at work, two people in the office were talking, and right after I walked by, they both started laughing. I know they were making fun of me. It says, but they weren't. They were laughing at a funny story. Next, it says, the cashier at lunch shorted me almost $1 in change. See if I ever go back there. They tried to cheat me. It says, but they didn't. It was an honest mistake. Now the woman says, I tried to call a close friend today and talk, but she refused to answer her phone. She was dodging my call. It says, but she wasn't. Her battery needed recharging. Then it says, I was running late for Wednesday Bible study, what we're having right now. I didn't sit where I usually sit. Instead, I had to ask a person to slide down the pew just to make a little room for me. She slid, but it wasn't 30 seconds till she got up and left because I made her mad by asking her to move. It says, but you didn't. She wasn't feeling well. She decided she needed to move, needed to leave. Then it says, after returning home from church, I crashed on the couch due to my rough day. My husband started washing a huge stack of dishes. That's his passive-aggressive way of saying you're not a very good housekeeper. And it says, but it wasn't. It was an act of love. But see, this woman, she had a terrible day, but it was all because she never gave anybody the benefit of the doubt. She assumed the worst about people instead of believing the best about people. Now, be honest. Don't you want people to believe the best about you? and to give you the benefit of the doubt, don't you think that we should do the same thing as well? Notice it says that love hopes all things. Let me share with you one other story here. Oh, how long should I pray for my husband? This comes from a writer named Jack Exum. He said, a woman once asked me that very question, how long should I pray for my husband? I replied, well, how long have you prayed for him? When she said that for 39 years she'd prayed every night for him, I was deeply touched. Pray on, I said. Her husband obeyed the gospel in the 41st year of prayer. That's over 14,000 times to ask. When Paul said, pray without ceasing, he was really saying three other words, never stop praying. Well, as we close tonight, I want to go back to where we started, those first few verses where there's those scenarios, if I can speak in tongues, or if I can move mountains, if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, if I surrender my body to be burnt, but I don't have love, then I'm nothing. It profits me nothing. Well, now we know what love is, right? And so really what you could do, you could go back and reread those verses, and it would read like this. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but I do not have love, meaning, but I'm not patient. I'm not kind. I'm jealous. I brag. I'm arrogant. I'm rude. All of those things. That's what he has in mind. If I don't have love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I can move mountain, but I don't have love, meaning I'm not patient, I'm not kind, I'm not all these things we talked about, I'm nothing. If I give all my possessions to feed the poor, somebody might say, well, that is love. But notice this. You could give all your possessions to feed the poor, but still be an impatient person, still be unkind to your spouse or unkind to people at church, still be jealous, still be, resentful, all of these things. If you don't have love, it profits you nothing. That's what Paul has in mind when he says love. And that's what love is so extremely important. And so I'll tell you what, we're out of time. Thank you so much for listening. Let's close out with prayer tonight, if you would bow with me. Our Heavenly Father, we're thankful we've had this time to look into your word, to look at how you define love. We know that what this world needs now is love. And God, we can't change other people, but we can change ourselves. Help us all to be people who love like we've read about tonight, the kind of love that you want us to have. We thank you for loving us. We thank you for sending your son Jesus to die on the cross for us. We pray in his name. Amen. Thank you all.